And you know how these leaders get, super humble and normal, right? So John of Leyden was like, hey, first of all, I'm the direct successor to King David from the Bible. I don't know if you guys knew that.
Okay.
Like the King David that killed Goliath when he was a twink. How about that audio snippet we just heard, Kayla?
What a great audio snippet.
What a
of
great
us in the
and
future.
relevant thing that we just heard that definitely exists already.
Or maybe funny and timely. Definitely one of the two.
Well, I guess we can at least say welcome to Culture Just Weird. We at least know that we need to say that.
We do need to say that. We need to say that I'm Kayla. I'm a television writer.
And I'm Chris, a game designer and data scientist. And, of course, we are both podcast hosts and cat owners.
You will hear the cats for sure this episode.
Okay. They won't go away. Like, it's either...
They won't go away.
Well, they have to be near us. And if we lock them out of the room, all they do is, like, scratch and whine. Yeah. And if we let them in the room, then they're like, oh, cool, we can chill. And then they, like, play, and they're loud either way.
Yeah.
Does anybody want a cat? I guess that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, me. I want them.
We already have them. Anyway. Kayla, do you have any business? I'm transitioning from some very shitty banter. Do you have any business? I don't have business.
Do I want to have any business?
Well, think about it, and we'll keep this whole dead space on air.
Oh, yeah, I do have a business.
Oh, you do?
Yeah. We just came off of, at the time of this recording, and basically the time of this release, we just came off of Black Friday, which transitioned smoothly into Small Business Saturday, and we're just...
Is that what the Saturday's called now?
In some circles, but just... It might also be the Sunday, I don't know. I think it's Small Business Saturday. Just a little reminder that MLMs are not small businesses. You are not supporting small businesses if you buy from MLMs.
That's good business.
Obviously, you want to support your friends when they're doing things that they're doing, but just a reminder that MLMs are not small businesses. They are scams.
The best way to support your friends in MLMs is to shame them.
Loudly and publicly, on social media preferably, because that changes everyone's minds.
Yeah, that's not a small business. So is Sunday like Big Corporation Sunday?
I think Sunday is Save Big Tech.
Okay.
I think it's use Facebook as much as you can Sunday.
All right, and then you have Amazon Monday. Yeah. We all know about that one.
And then tomorrow is Giving Tuesday, in which all of the email blasts that I have unsubscribed from over the last year re-add me to their lists and ask for money.
God.
And I wish I had more money to give, but I am but a lowly podcast host.
Why?
Keep me off your email blasts, please.
It's like, the thing that I really don't like about the email blast thing is that, like, I get that, you have a job to do and it's all about percentages and, like, you have to make my life miserable, and that's how the modern world works, is making my life miserable. But at least don't lie to me with the little checkbox of I don't wish to receive emails when I enter in my account information. Like, at least... Instead of the checkbox, if it was just like a little statement that said...
A middle finger that said,
a little middle finger that said, like, we're going to send you emails no matter what you do, so go fuck yourself. Like, at least if they were honest, it would be... I don't know. Anyway.
Also, I do want to say one more thing, because there is also another event that happens around this time of, like, the consumer calendar year. I think it's Buy Nothing Day.
Isn't that redundant?
Yeah, that's true. Buy Nothing Day is a small but growing movement that accompanies Black Friday, and the idea is that, like, to protest or counterbalance or not participate in the, like, consumer holiday that is Black Friday, folks are doing Buy Nothing Day, where they buy nothing. We even have a current listener and Patreon subscriber who has observed such holiday and told us about it, so I wanted to make sure to mention it on the show here today.
Buy Nothing Day, brought to you by Amazon.
You can Buy Nothing Day. You can do Buy Nothing Day whenever you want.
Well, also, that reminds me, thank you to our Patreon subscribers. I don't really have any business there, other than to say, go not on... If you're observing Buy Nothing Day, don't subscribe to us on that day. But if you want to do Small Business Saturday or Sunday, whatever
Small
day...
Business whatever day.
Then go subscribe to this small business, Culture Just Weird, on our Patreon.
.com.
.com/cultists. Yeah, great. Cool. We're part of the problem now.
Yeah.
All right.
That was true the second we turned the mic on that first episode.
That was true the second we were born.
Yeah.
On to the story of today.
The story. So you're going to tell us a story today? No cult today, just a story?
What? No, it's a story every time. What are you talking about? Oh. Every single episode, it's a story about a cult.
Gotcha.
But actually, you're going to tell us the story first. Kayla, as usual, I have a question for you.
Shoot.
It's a bit personal, though, so I want to warn you of that before we proceed. And, of course, you don't have to talk about anything on the show that you are not comfortable talking about.
Okay.
My question to you, if you are willing to discuss on record...
I poop twice a day.
That's it? That's like 5 times. No, but...
sometimes if it's more, my dietitian goes like, you shouldn't be pooping
or how much
that
fiber you have.
Or how much anxiety you have.
Yeah. So it's good. So last episode we talked about No Nut November. This episode we're talking about poop.
You're talking about personal. I just wanted to
that is not
cut you off at the pass.
No, it's a different personal question.
Gotcha.
My question for you is, can you tell me a little bit about what you did for your birthday this year? The ritual part, not the celebratory parts.
I don't think I had a celebratory part.
Was there no?
It was deep pandemic.
Oh yeah,
that was like bad
it was February,
times.
So that was like, especially here, it was like major spike. But it was an alpha spike, so it was like, man,
it was nothing.
I wish.
Back in the day, no, I'm happy to talk about what I did for my birthday this year. This year I was baptized into the Ecumenical Catholic Church.
So I have the 5 W's here to ask you. So what and when was baptism into the Ecumenical Catholic Church? When was on your birthday? Where did we do it?
We did it at the beach. We did it at El Segundo Beach.
Mm-hmm. And by a priest of that church, correct?
Yes.
And how was it done?
We all, you and me and the priest and his cousin showed up at the beach, and he asked me some questions, and I lied and said yes.
Okay, this is on air, dude.
Okay.
Do you want me to keep that? I don't know.
No, because
the priest listens?
I didn't lie. I have my own interpretation. And I.
Oh, okay. So just in case I don't edit this out, what did you mean by?
Okay, so let me continue. He asked me some questions. I answered them with answers that were to my interpretation of what I believe, which I think we on the podcast have a pretty clear understanding of what those beliefs are at this point. And he poured water on my head.
All right.
And it was water from the River Jordan.
That was pretty cool. And we still have some of it.
We do still have some of it.
Just to further clarify a little bit, I don't think you were lying to the priest.
Okay.
I think you were, when you say to your interpretation, I think it's people that are longtime listeners might know that it's like a more of a spiritual but not religious type thing where like
right.
it's true to our.
I can say what my answers meant.
Sure.
So my beliefs are more secular than spiritual. I believe when the priest asks me about like God and Jesus, the interpretations of those things for me are the physical universe, which allows for the conditions to for a compassionate human community to exist. And for me, a compassionate human community is what the Christian and Catholic faiths are generally about. And things like Jesus and God and the other stories are metaphors and symbols for compassionate human community. And so when somebody's like, hey, do you believe in these things? Yeah, I do. But I believe in them in this way. And if you say like, oh, what do you think about the devil? Well, I'm pro the Church of Satan. And also, if you're asking me, do I take a stand against any obstacles for
the Satanic Temple specifically, right? Because there's different.
Is that what I said?
You said the Church of Satan. I'm not sure if that's the same thing.
No, I'm talking about Satanic Temple, baby.
Yeah,
that's the Satanic
Temple. There might be a Church of Satan that's like also dope, but I don't.
No, we're talking about Satanic Temple on this show. But in the context of this baptism, if the priest goes, boo the devil, I go boo anything that's an obstacle to the pursuit of a compassionate human community.
I think that makes sense.
So those were my answers. And just to also clarify a little further, the Ecumenical Catholic Church is different from what's the other one? Is different from the Roman Catholic Church.
There's actually, One thing that I have learned doing this episode is that the sharding of not sharting, sharding with a D.
Maybe the schisming.
No, I like sharding because it paints a picture of the Christian faith is of multitudes.
Yes.
Like even just within the Catholic tradition, there's multiple
right.
Catholic churches. The one that we all are like, know and love, familiar with like, Popey McPoperson is the Roman Catholic Church.
Right.
The Ecumenical Catholic Church is very similar, but has some key differences.
The Ecumenical Catholic Church basically is like, yeah, the Pope is a cool guy. We also are not beholden to his beliefs and viewpoints. And the Ecumenical Catholic Church was founded in the 80s, specifically by, I believe, a gay man who was affected by the AIDS crisis. And it was supposed to be a home for the LGBTQ community who did not have much of a home back then. So it's a very gay affirming church. It is a very progressive in its ideals. So like divorce is okay. I mean, it's not like celebrated, but it's like, yes.
Woo, divorce. Hell yeah.
We will support you through your divorce. It is, the priests can marry, the priests can be any gender. There's, progressive views on reproductive autonomy and things like that. So it's...
But then it shares a lot of like the creeds and traditions
right.
of Catholicism on that. So
it was like, we want to be progressive, but we also want the liturgy.
Right. We want the community and we want the cultural traditions, but there are some things that we would prefer to be different.
Right.
About who we allow to participate and welcome it.
Right.
Do you feel more like part of that community now after being baptized? Was there like a before and after there?
I think for me, because it was the reason why I wanted to pursue baptism was because you're baptized in the Catholic Church.
The Roman Catholic
Church.
Not the Ecumenical Catholic. Sorry.
Yeah. Our son was baptized in the Catholic Church right after he was born, right before he died. And so I wanted to have that kind of symbolic spiritual connection to my family here on earth and, in the spiritual secular afterlife.
Do you feel like that the baptism succeeded in that?
Well, I didn't want you to just be able to have that connection to him.
We've also so did that succeed?
Yes.
You did feel like that?
Yeah.
Cool. So that covers my why did you get baptized question. How do you feel about being baptized as an adult versus like as a child?
So as an adult, obviously you can consent to something, you can make a choice to do something, you're coming at it from a place of free will. As a child, you don't have those things. I don't necessarily think that that's like bad or inappropriate. I think that when you're baptized, when you're born, it's more of a cultural tradition at that point, and there's nothing wrong with being born into cultural traditions. It's actually very beautiful to be able to pass those things on to your family. I do think that for some people, not for everybody, but for some people, making that choice later in life might have more spiritual significance for them. But I mean, I'm sure there's plenty of people that were baptized at birth that have plenty of spiritual significance and connection to that moment.
So for Arthur, who didn't have the rest of his life to ponder that, do you feel like his experience being baptized, that was like, what do you feel about like the difference between his baptism and yours?
That baptism was 100% for us. I mean, yeah, he was a tiny baby in the throes of dying. He did not really have any understanding of consent or what was going on. The baptism was largely for you and I who understood what was going on, and to forge an emotional, spiritual, symbolic connection in like a really tough moment.
What do you think a more supernatural believer might say to answer that question?
I mean, I don't know that much about the spiritual, supernatural side of it. I assume that baptism, that moment, it would feel like our child's soul is going to like the good afterlife, and we'll see him again later. Like, I had people ask me that, like, oh, did you get baptized so that you can see your son again someday? And for me, the answer to that is no. I unfortunately, I don't believe that that's something that's going to happen. But having that connection while I'm here does give me comfort, and does give me just a little bit of comfort that while I do not think I'm going to die and then go to heaven and see people, knowing that symbolic moment of spiritual connection happened, like, that transcends emotionally and spiritually. Mm-hmm. That transcends, the physical death.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's also the, just a little like, just in case the Pascal's dilemma.
Also that.
Just cover your bases. Of course, we didn't get him baptized in anything else, so like hopefully
Catholics
crossed
is right.
on the Catholics are right. But
question for you though.
Oh wow, this is very interesting. It's not your episode. And you're asking me questions.
You're asking me questions about
I know. No,
baptism.
That's fair. Yeah.
You're somebody who was baptized at birth. So what is your connection to that moment?
While I am unprepared to answer this, I feel it's kind of what you were saying earlier, is that I don't think that either version of baptism, I don't think being baptized as an adult is wrong. I don't think being baptized as a child is wrong. I think that they just have very different spiritual meanings and implications for people.
Right.
Which is sort of like what all that line of questioning was about for you,
sure.
In case you haven't figured that out yet. But I think there's maybe a little bit of, we'll get to that too, because there's, a bunch of stuff that we're going to talk about. So I don't feel like my being baptized as a child was about consent or not, because the meaning is different for Catholics than it is for people who don't baptize their children, who baptize as adults. Not just Catholics, by the way. There's many Christian denominations that baptize children.
Are there non-Christian denominations that do baptism?
Not baptism, but we will get to that.
Oh, interesting.
Well, Kayla, I certainly do appreciate your openness to discuss that very personal experience with me for our listeners. I ask you and said listeners to put some of those ideas in your back pocket, because we may come back to a few of those points later in the show. Now, as y'all may have guessed from our opening discussion, today's show is religious in nature, which is sorta kinda the first time we've discussed a religion on Cult or Just Weird, depending on your definition of the word religion.
I'm sorry, we talked about Zumba.
Again, depending on your definition of the word religion. Of course, your definition of the word religion is sort of the rub, isn't it? Lord knows I've had many multiple people suggest to me, oh, you should do such and such religion on the show, which that's great, and it's honestly like a great suggestion, but there are reasons that we haven't done so for so long. Chief among those reasons is that I'm just lazy, and talking about any established religion at all is pretty daunting, because most established religions have a whopping giant helping of history and cultural context behind them. And as our listeners know, we get a little carried away on context. Secondary among those reasons is, of course, most established religions have a good chunk of followers, and we try not to be culturally insensitive or offensive on the show. But I think this reason is more or less evaporated for me, because now that we're getting to the end of our third season, we've talked about many, many groups with many, many different followers of different stripes, and I hope, I pray, we've been fair in our research and analysis, and we try to adhere to the nothing about us without us as much as we are able to. So I feel a little bit more comfortable about that reason, I think, in this juncture of our professional podcast shit. And the third reason is certainly easily the most important reason, and it cuts right to the very center of the beating heart of this show. And that is, what is a religion exactly? What is a cult exactly? Is it a cult or just weird? I mean, even just saying religion in the sentences above, I don't want to offend believers of X religion, and most religions have history and culture. It's inescapable when talking about those things to wonder, okay, but what do I mean by that? What do I mean by religion? What do I mean by established religion? When does it have enough believers? When is it not so niche that we drop the cult pejorative and pick up the religion moniker?
This is what I have been wondering literally my entire life. Literally my entire life.
I know. When has it been around long enough or been entrenched in culture long enough that it's a religion, not a cult? This is a very hard question. Capital V, capital H, very hard. And there's no definitive answer.
But we're going to bring you one here today on Cult or Just...
I actually have that joke like a sentence down.
Sorry.
I'll skip it now. No, thank you. Thank you for covering it. Yeah, I mean, there's a threshold of believers or like per capita believers, or, if you've been X number of years in existence, then that makes you part of club religion. It's just like, a feeling, man. You know, it's like hard to define. So yeah, so in lieu of a definitive answer, yeah, we made this podcast where we promptly went 3 full seasons before discussing a religion. But hey, the important thing is now, thanks to this show, as you said, we as a civilization now have a definitive, absolute ruling on the matter. It's just absolute black and white, and cult is definitely a real word with precise and measurable meaning, and no, none of that's true, of course.
It's not.
No,
I was about to smack you.
No, none of that's true. It's a big mess. All of it is a big mess of gray goo. But it always is, and after all, that's why scholars like to talk about things like new religious movements rather than cults. It's for this very reason of language precision. It marks off a clear boundary for what they are talking about. In this case, religious movements that are, relatively speaking, not as old as most other religious movements. It's a new religious movement. Since cult is a colloquial term, we here at the show believe that it can apply to more than just religious groups, obviously, since most of our episodes have been about those. Not that those groups don't use many of the motifs and themes of religions, but that's out of scope for today. But yeah, I do like the term new religious movement to refer to a subset of what we might call cults colloquially, specifically a subset of groups where their primary value mirrors that of more traditional religions. Spiritual growth, penance and atonement, rebirth themes, afterlife, etc., that sort of thing.
So not Zumba.
Well, I don't know. I mean, Zumba has all those things.
It does have a before and after. Hashtag rebirth.
Right. Rebirth, penance and atonement, because it's just
so punishing.
Self-flagellating. I don't know if it's got the afterlife thing.
I think when you die in Zumba.
You go to Zumba heaven?
Yeah.
There you go. See? Religion. We called it. But again, even this gets super mungy, right? Because there's groups that you'd call like, oh my God, that's an 11 out of 10 on the cult scale. But they'd call themselves religions.
Right.
Right? David Koresh was believed to be the second coming of Christ. And that's probably the easiest example to think of, David Koresh of the Branch Davidians. But munginess and gray area aside, today's show is religion or just weird. Or religion or just new religious movement. And before I introduce the topic itself, I do need to state here, and hopefully I'll remember to reiterate this several times, I am not a religious scholar. I'm a data scientist and game designer, as we mentioned at the top of the show, and I am a casual fan of history, and I love learning about things, religious history included, but primary researcher, peer-reviewed writer of scholarly articles, I am not. Oh, and the other thing I am is host of a podcast, so I should probably tell you about today's topic, which is the Amish.
Oh, bringing it back.
Yeah, bringing it back.
Bringing it on back to episode something earlier we did this year.
Episode 9, of this season. So specifically, we'll be doing our patented cult or just weird context binge, and I'll be talking about the history of the Amish and their various neighbors, fellow twigs on the tree of Christian taxonomy, or as we mentioned before, shards. Not shards, shards.
Shards with a D.
Shards with a D. If you are an established listener of this show, or you've been listening at least since episode 9 of this 3rd season, you will probably already know why we selected the Amish as a show topic. If you haven't listened to that episode entitled The Blue Curtains, then you might benefit from taking a pause here and going back, because it will be referenced a couple of times, but it's also, I wouldn't say it's mandatory. You can totally listen to this episode independently. The topic of that episode was Lizzie Hirschberger's story and Molly Maeve Egan's telling of it, the latter of whom we interviewed for it on that episode. The story, which was about Lizzie's upbringing in the Schwarzenruber Amish community and her abuse at the hands of some of its members. But the story and the interview were both excellent, very important and very interesting. So afterward, Kayla and I discussed, and we decided that it was definitely worth doing the whole context thing and learning and sharing more about the community in which Lizzie's story occurred. Alrighty then, so since Lizzie's story occurred around the turn of the 21st century...
Ugh, don't say that.
And...
That's a horrible way of putting it.
Oh, sorry. A mere... Well, the problem... I wanted to say turn of the 21st century because she's believe in her 40s, and these events occurred over this...
Right.
Over the course of her life, so I wasn't sure if I said late 1900s or... Okay, no matter how you say it, we sound really old.
The kids say late 1900s
I don't
now.
like that.
It's what it's got to be. It's what it's got to be.
Just let me say turn of the 21st century. Anyway, and this is culture just weird. That means we need to go back. Let's see. Carry the one. Back to the 1st century BC.
Fuck yeah.
So a shade over 2,000 years ago is all that's required for us to do context.
Perfect.
It's child's play for us, right? Like, come on, that's not even a tenth as far back as the lost Lemurian continent. So, like, it's basically yesterday to someone like Ramtha.
Come on.
Yeah.
Ramtha, we should probably interview her for this episode.
I don't think so.
Them. They?
I don't know. I think Ramtha is a him.
Ramtha's a he. Jay-Z Knight's a she.
I believe so. I don't know. Well, yeah, we'll ask her. Him. Anyway, yes, we are talking sometime around a few decades before 0 AD and a few decades after. Now, based on the fact that we're talking about religion today and the time frame we're talking about here, cough, cough, 0 AD, Kayla, can you guess the guy I'm about to mention?
Pope John Paul II.
No, that's way off.
Rasputin.
Nope, still way off.
Gilgamesh.
Give me a real guess. 0 AD, talking about religion.
D.
Baptism.
You're talking about D.
At some point, you have to give me a real... At some point... What would we do if we just did this for like an extra like half hour? You just like gave me like random guesses.
You're finna talk about Jesus Christ.
That is... Wait, no, actually, no. That is still wrong.
No!
Still wrong.
Jesus not Christ?
Close, though. Very close.
Mary.
I actually want to briefly talk about essentially the beta version of Jesus.
What?
The Hydrox to Jesus' Oreo.
What? There was a Hydrox Jesus?
Absolutely. Well, actually, to be fair, Hydrox was... Well, no, that's a good... Yeah, Hydrox was first. So this is... And that Hydrox was first, but everybody loves... Oh my God, that's the perfect analogy. I didn't even realize it.
I didn't know that.
It's the perfect analogy. Hydrox is first, but everybody loves Oreo. Anyway, the Hydrox in this case is John the Baptist.
Oh, okay. Yes, I know. I've heard of him.
You have heard of this man.
Yes.
Yeah, he's famous. I mean, he's a very important religious figure.
He baptized Mr. Jesus.
He did. We will get to that. John the Baptist is known for a lot of things, and he's considered a saint in most Christian denominations that do the whole saint thing, and the biggies there are like Roman Catholics do the saint thing. I think Eastern Orthodox does as well. So he's the patron saint of just like a ton of shit, like too much to cover. There's like a whole laundry list of things, but I think you can probably take a wild stab at what he's best known for. Actually, you already said what he's best known for. Yeah, he's sort of kinda the originator of specifically the Christian concept of baptism. So
just one day some guy came up and was like, I'm going to do this.
Yeah. He came along with like a super soaker and was like, pew, 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 here's some water from the River Jordan. Pew, pew, Kayla's going to have some of this one day.
I wonder what it was like to live in a time where you could have an original idea.
Well...
And it probably wasn't even an original idea.
Yeah, right.
Oh, no.
So we'll get to that right now. I said sort of kind of the originator because, as you might imagine from the nature of this information, it's a bit of a fuzzy fact to say that this guy, like, definitely originated it himself.
Gotcha.
Religious initiation rituals, of course, are absolutely ubiquitous.
Tale as old as time.
And cleansing is a pretty popular religious motif. Water cleansing, so much so that it gets its own name, ablution, which is the act of ritual washing. Pretty much every major religion has some form of it. Christianity, of course, has baptism, but they also have like a ton of other stuff. They're kind of obsessed with ritual washing. There's foot washing, ritual hand washing, anointments, and more. Islam has, and please forgive me if I'm getting any of this wrong or mispronouncing, I ablution myself of any wrongdoing by saying I'm not a religious scholar, but Islam has 3 acts called wudu, which is a daily wash. That's W-U-D-U. Ghusl, G-H-U-S-L, a bathing ablution, and tayammum, T-A-Y-A-M-M-U-M, a waterless ablution. And so I'm stealing this directly from Wikipedia again. In Judaism, ritual washing or ablution takes 2 main forms. Tevila, which is a full-body immersion in something called a mikveh, and Netilat Yadayim. Again, I'm so sorry if I'm like butchering
Your
this.
Hebrew's great.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And that's the washing of the hands with a cup. Shintoism, which is popular in Japan, has what's called misogi, a ritual washing of the entire body. Buddhists have ablution. Hindus have ablution. You've probably heard of ritual washing in the holy Ganges River, but they have other stuff too. Like, basically everyone has ablution.
Wicca has it. Paganism has it.
I didn't know that, but that does not surprise me even a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, is any of that a surprise, really? Washing oneself is, first of all, it's like a very, like, basic act. And it's probably also, like, a pretty pro-survival thing to reinforce in a culture. I imagine that, like, any religion, this is just me speculating now, again, not a religious scholar, but I imagine that any religion that doesn't reinforce that behavior probably finds itself with fewer followers over time than religions that do reinforce that behavior, right? And on top of that, the act of washing typically has, positive effects on your nervous system. The ritual of the morning, or depending on who you are, evening shower is powerful in its own right. Forget,
oh man, I took a shower this morning. I feel so much better.
Yeah, exactly. That's my next line is, it can make you feel better even if you weren't physically dirty. I mean, how many times do we see in film even some character committing or being involved in some act that just like stains their soul, and then washing their hands or taking a shower after?
Literally wrote that into my last script.
Yeah,
I was like, ooh, bloody shower scene.
Yeah, exactly.
The blood washes off.
It's a trope now, man. Because that's okay. Like, it's just, it speaks to us in a certain way. It's like the physical washing feels also like an emotional, spiritual, nervous system washing. And, I mean, didn't Pontius Pilate wash his hands?
Oh, Pontius.
After condemning Jesus to death? Don't we even say, I wash my hands of this as an idiom, meaning I absolve myself of any guilt or relation to this act? So, yeah, going all the way back to John the Baptist, that's why I think it's hard to like definitively say, yeah, this guy invented Christian baptism, because ablution, of which baptism is a subtype, is so ubiquitous.
Gotcha.
What he's credited for, though, are a few things. One, he was an important itinerant prophet in his own right. I wasn't kidding when I called him the beta version of Jesus. According to the Gospel of Luke, he and Jesus were actually even related.
What?
Although the Bible does not specify how exactly.
Wait, through Mary or through God?
The Bible does not specify how exactly. Good question.
Which
if it's
side
through
of
Joseph,
the
I don't know if
church is
that
he
counts.
sitting on in the wedding?
Is he sitting on the God side or the Mary side? Yeah. Of Nazareth side. Of Nazareth. Or the Christ side.
The Christ side or the Nazarene side.
But yeah, John the Baptist was basically like a Jesus that didn't quite get over that messianic hump and go viral the way Jesus did. But he did have his own devoted following at the time. And scholars think that Jesus actually picked up a bunch of John followers when he got into the family business of profiting around. Christians and Muslims both have a place for John the Baptist in their pantheon of important prophets. And in fact, there's still a religious group today known as the Mandaeans, I believe is how it's pronounced, Mandaeans, Mandaeans, whose chief prophet is still John the Baptist.
Whoa.
They're a pretty interesting group who, according to Wikipedia, quote, are an ethno-religious group native to the alluvial plain of southern Mesopotamia who are followers of Mandaeism. They were possibly the earliest to practice baptism and the last surviving Gnostics from antiquity.
Wow.
End quote.
Wait, are they still around?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. They're still around. Yeah. Okay, so that's the first thing about John the Baptist. He's a very important prophet in his own right, and in his time he was basically proto-Jesus. Secondly, according to Christian theology, although this sounds a bit like a retcon to me, but whatever. According to Christian theology, John the Baptist prophesied the coming of an even greater prophet than himself, who would, of course, be Jesus himself. Which brings me to the third thing. He baptized Jesus. And you already mentioned that, but yeah, this may be sort of like the baptism of Christian faiths, but as I mentioned earlier, it comes from a milieu of existing religious ablution. Again, I'm going to quote from Wikipedia, quote, the practice of baptism emerged from Jewish ritualistic practices during the Second Temple period. And the Second Temple period is sort of like 400 to 500 years BC to like just after, I think like roughly Jesus' death, like, decades 80. So the practice of baptism emerged from the Jewish ritualistic practices during the Second Temple period, out of which figures such as John the Baptist emerged. End quote. So you have this period where ritualistic washing is an important part of that era of Jewish religious tradition. That era produced itinerant prophets such as John the Baptist, and you can probably trace some of the popularity of why there were so many like messianic prophets in that era to like some of the persecution that Jewish folks were facing in that part of the world from like the Seleucids and then the Romans.
Right.
And then John the Baptist happened to baptize his cousin that went on to be the charismatic leader of a new religious movement that would eventually cover the globe, taking its baptism practices with it. So, did John the Baptist invent baptism for Christians? Like, he didn't really invent it. He was just like, sort of like the first guy. And I think it was like, it was sort of like one of those like chaotic, like he lucked out things. Because there was like just, that was a practice that was happening at that time in the Jewish faith.
If he had baptized his other cousin, Beezus.
Right.
It wouldn't have worked out.
If Bon the Baptist baptized Beezus, and Beezus was the guy that ended up becoming, the charismatic leader of the free world, then we'd be talking about him instead.
Isn't that the plot of Life of Brian?
That's like almost literally the plot of Life of Brian. Yeah. All right. So any thoughts so far about baptism, early baptism, or even how you feel about your own participation in this millennia-old ritual? And I mean millennia-old in its current form. Certainly ablution is much older than that.
Oh, yeah. That was also a dope part of participating in baptism, was just like connecting to a millennia-old practice. It was cool to be like, oh, a bunch of people have done this. I mean, it's like anytime you participate in some sort of ritual. I mean, even like something when I'm cooking, I get like that, where it's like, man, we've been doing this for such a long time, and it's cool to participate. Like that's a spiritual experience in and of itself.
Yeah, I agree. All right, let's fast forward a bit and look out the window of our time machine at the scenery before we stop and get out in a specific time period. If you're wondering where the word baptism comes from, it comes from the Hellenistic Greek word baptismos.
Oh, shocking.
I know. It's hard to see the relation there, which means, and this is even more shocking, ritual washing.
Oh, wow. Real creative we get.
I know. And that word, of course, travels to us through time and space via Latin and then via the Catholicism usage of Latin to English as the word baptism. The etymological roots of baptismos are actually even older than that, and apparently have like Proto-Indo-European language roots, which end up meaning like to dip or to overwhelm. So it's like this really sort of like understandably, not surprisingly, ancient etymological root. Because washing, right? Because
washing.
The vast majority of Christians practice some form of baptism, with notable exceptions being the Quakers. Woohoo, go Quakers. I went to Penn, whose mascot is the Quaker. And the Salvation Army. Yes, they are a religion. No, they don't baptize. No, we don't have time to talk about them. So those are a few little fun factoids about baptism. Here's my penultimate fun factoid about it. People aren't the only things to get baptized.
Ooh, what else can you baptize?
Objects can get baptized, too.
What?
Yeah.
Like
now,
what?
Hold
like a
on.
stick?
Okay, hold
like
on.
What?
Yeah, a stick. Yeah, I baptize this stick in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. If you're thinking, what the hell, which it sounds like you are, then consider the synonym for baptism that usually gets used in the case of objects, christening. So when I said that, maybe you have thought of the christening of boats and ships.
Oh, I would thought immediately of like the christening is another word for baptism.
Yeah, it is, but
yeah, boat.
Yeah. So
boats get baptized.
That's right, where you do the whole breaking the champagne bottle and whatnot. In some cases, such as like the Crusades, which is where this practice allegedly began, where Christian priests would like bless ships that the Crusaders were on to have a safe journey.
The Crusaders were going on a cruise ship.
Oh, that's where the word cruise came from.
Yeah, that's
definitely.
Where it came from. Yep.
Definitely quote us on that, please. So yeah, but that's where the practice began. But in some cases, a priest will sprinkle holy water onto the ship. So I wasn't able to discern whether this was considered like a quote-unquote actual baptism, or whether this was just a case where it's like, it's a similar process, so we borrow the word, it's about blessing something. It's not like It's not like it's getting, the Queen Mary into heaven or whatever. Like, I'm pretty sure it's not that.
Did the Titanic go to heaven? That's all I want to know.
Yes, of course the Titanic went to heaven and it's running swimming, around the Rainbow Bridge for boats, and everything's nice. But ships aren't the only thing. According to Wikipedia, church bells also get christened.
What?
Quote, the name baptism of bells has been given to the blessing of musical, especially church bells, at least in France since the 11th century. It is derived from the washing of the bell with holy water by the bishop before he anoints it with essentially his holy oil. A fuming censer is then placed under the bell, and the bishop prays that these sacraments of the church may, at the sound of the bell, put demons to flight, protect from storms, and call the faithful to prayer. End quote. It's pretty badass, right?
It's pretty badass.
It's like enchanting the bell.
Anoint this bell with some oil and be like, get out of here, demons. Come on, my friends.
Yeah, like I'm like imagining like there's some like glowing rune that appears on the side of the bell.
There's gotta be a glowing rune.
And finally, in Cornwall, in England, they baptize dolls.
Okay, that's a horror movie. I'm sorry. Sorry, no offense. That is how a horror movie begins. Like Annabelle? Like who?
Dolls.
What dolls? Any doll? Cabbage Patch Kids? Or like what?
I'm not clear on what types of dolls. But in case you weren't already creeped out by dolls, yeah, there's a whole community that fucking baptizes their dolls. Sorry, creepy doll owners.
Okay, but when you say
your
dolls
probably
do you mean
have
like,
souls.
Like a real doll? Do you mean those like super
Again, I don't know.
realistic baby dolls?
Still don't know.
Okay. All right.
I'll link the article in our
Please
show
do.
notes that I read
it.
about this. But fear not, as creepy as it sounds, the tradition in Cornwall is actually kind of nice. It's like this like fairy pool, basically just like out in the countryside that they call the Well of the Little People. Okay, actually, that's still a pretty creepy name.
Well, little people, I mean, in this context, refers to like fairy type
folk. Yeah.
folk. Yeah.
Yeah. And they call it dolly dunking. And I guess that's kind of creepy too. And it's supposed to invoke spirits represented by the dolls to protect the well and sort of like its surroundings.
Okay.
That's almost not creepy.
I have a lot of problems.
It's
got a lot of problems with
it's
that.
kind of not creepy.
So what happens if you don't baptize your doll? Like, it has a spirit? Dolls have... So you're admitting...
Kayla.
That dolls are alive.
Toy
Story is
that's
real.
That's what makes this creepy.
Toy Story confirmed.
Listen, I would love to tell you more about dolly dunking. The problem is, there's actually not that much information about it because it's like just people in Cornwall.
Group,
it's like literally, it's like 10 people. I mean, it's just a tiny village. And this I'm already talking about like history of all religions, so like I need to kind of like calm down. But yeah, I think it's cool. I kind of love it, and I very much would like to visit Cornwall now and check it out. But if you want to do it, if you want to go ahead and baptize a doll, and you find yourself in Cornwall, it does seem to only happen on Good Friday, so plan accordingly. The final factoid I want to bring up about baptism is that, well, it's been 2,000 years since John dunked on Jesus, and let's just say that that's given a lot of time for us to argue over the proper and valid way to do it. Before we get out of our time machine in the year of our Lord 1436 AD, Kayla, I just want to ask you again, just sort of like to reiterate, how do you feel about the fact that you were baptized as a fully sentient, fully brain-developed, fully experienced adult versus if you had been baptized as a dumbass little baby who had no idea what was going on?
Look, I think if I had been baptized as a baby, whatever that religion was would feel more cultural rather than like spiritually significant, and would have given me the option then to further explore that spiritual tradition or not. And having been baptized as an adult, I don't know. It was I largely pursued baptism as a spiritual symbol, as opposed to like, let's, open up this whole can of worms on this religion. It very much felt like a choice that I was consenting to. And I think it felt spiritually meaningful rather than, culturally significant. Whereas I think, from my understanding of folks that were baptized as kids, the folks that I know, there's more of that cultural aspect to it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it also depends on how you feel about the supernatural and how you feel about God and in the actual things that the Bible is saying. I think for me, I have a similar sort of, although I was baptized as a child, I think, for me it's more cultural. But if you take the religious value of it, like at face value, what Catholics and other infant baptizers would say is that you are essentially saving this child from original sin.
Right.
So specifically in Catholicism, you're washing away the original sin that Adam and Eve, did their whole thing.
Right.
And even though there's still a tendency to sin after that, because you got to keep them in the church, right? You can't just completely wash it away.
Right.
But it's more about the hey, a child should be innocent, but it's totally not because of original sin.
Right.
But who can make them innocent is us. So they see it as sort of like this holy seal that is sort of placed on the soul, and you can't unseal it or put a different seal on it later. So that's sort of how it's viewed religiously. I have some
quibbles with that
quibbles
viewpoint.
And quabbles.
Yeah.
Well, but that's why they don't.
Me.
Yeah, but that's why they don't. For them, it's not about consent, right? Because it's not about a willingness. It's not about a covenant with God,
right?
Which is what it is about with adult baptism. People that believe in adult baptism or what's called believers baptism, for them, it's about entering into a willing covenant with God, and you have to have your free will and your consent and all that, life experience in order to do that, because it's about that. But again, for infant baptizers, it's not about that. It's about the sort of magical seal to ward off original sin. So it's they're they both think the other is sort of wrong and invalid form of baptism, but they're both very different reasons, which, well, I think I'll get back to that.
Kind of feels maybe both should be a thing. If you're following a religious tradition, it kind of feels like maybe you should have the baby one, make sure that that pesky old sin is washed off, and then also an adult.
Just in case.
Yeah, well, an adult version of it. And I know that there's, confirmation in the Catholic Church when you're, a young teenager or an old child. But
that's how Catholicism has their cake and eats it too. Is that the baptism is the magic seal,
adult.
And then the confirmation is the I am confirming that this is definitely what I want, consent, covenant with God. But you're right. When you do confirmation, you're a young teen with an undeveloped brain and only a small smidge of life experience. I
just think in some ways adult confirmation is probably more spiritually significant for that person.
I agree. And I think that adult / believer baptism people would probably agree with you as well.
But that isn't to say that people who have gone through confirmation as a child don't have that covenant with God. I think it's just if this is the way it happened and it worked out for you, that's awesome and cool. And also there's other ways of doing things, and that's okay. It's just kind of, it's there's a time and there's a place and an option and a time for all of this. Maybe figure out what works best for you.
Yeah. There's also a little fun little factoid here. The Catholic Church recognizes 3 forms of baptism.
Oh.
There's sort of, I forget what the regular kind is called, but that's where it's hey, you can get the water and whatever. There's also what's called baptism by desire, which means that you intend to get baptized, but then between the time where you intend it and then it actually happens, something goes wrong. Basically you die.
Right.
And then it's considered that because you wanted to be baptized, you are then actually baptized by the church.
Yeah.
And then there's baptism by blood, which is my favorite because of the name. But baptism by blood is basically so that they can say that all of the early Christian martyrs that died before the whole baptism thing was set in stone.
Right.
They're oh yeah, actually they were baptized because they gave up their lives for Christendom.
Gotcha.
Anyway, all of that is just to say it's an interesting conflict, right? And by interesting, actually, I mean violent sometimes. So
wait, people are really fighting because some people are baptized babies and some people are baptized adults?
People are upset.
You guys!
People are unhappy.
Come on! I mean, I get it, but come on.
All right, so we're stopping our time machine now in 1436, which is just in time for us to step out and either high five or backhand, depending on your preference, Johannes Gutenberg, inventor of the printing press. Honestly, we should probably do both, just to be safe. We should probably backhand him and high five him. But the printing press, as any historian will tell you, was important.
Yes.
The historical significance and importance of the printing press cannot be overstated, really. There's enough significance to it for me to just slather all over multiple multi-hour podcast episodes. But since this is just the lightning round version, the printing press was a technological innovation and disruption in mass media the likes the world had never seen. In fact, the world had maybe never even seen mass media at all before. Because before the printing press, books had to be hand copied.
Oh, God.
Books were thus extremely rare, extremely valuable, extremely hard to come by. So those, actually, here's a little anecdote. Those chains that they sometimes see in like old-timey, like medieval books. Maybe you don't remember this, but in Game of Thrones, there was like a mega library. I forget where it was, but there was like chains on the bookshelves. Do you remember that?
Oh, no.
So it was actually depicted a little bit incorrectly. The chains aren't just there for like decoration or to hold the books in. They're actually there used to be chains, but they were like attached to individual books.
Wow.
And there was like, a lock on the chain.
Right.
So like for you to be able to get the book out, you had to like, it was just hard to steal books because books were like mad valuable back then.
Wow.
They were the NFTs of their day, Kayla.
You could right click?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Well, you couldn't right-click copy until Johannes Gutenberg came along, inventing the right-click save of his day.
So he was a troll.
So he was definitely a troll. But yeah, so at this time, Bibles and the information contained within them could easily be monopolized by the Catholic clergy. It's hard for us to understand today what it must have been like before the printing press because of just how many words we consume every single day, with literacy rates in the developed world and like the high 90 percentile. But before the printing press, reading was just like not a common path to knowledge and information. And as important as religion was to medieval life, spiritually, yes, but also communally, politically, culturally, controlling that information faucet gave you wide power and control over people's lives. And with an iron-fisted monopoly on religious power and control means, well, the same thing it usually means with monopolies. You don't exactly need to produce the best product for your customers. And in the late medieval period, well, the Catholic Church is not putting out the best religious product to its customers, to say the least. Again, this is by itself a vast topic, but by the time Mr. Gutenberg invents the printing press, the Catholic Church has produced a laundry list of abuses as tall as the day is long.
Wasn't a great time.
Monetary corruption, violence, political machinations, sex abuses, more corruption. There was the papacy in exile in Avignon, France for like 70 years. Popes were going to war, taking mistresses and concubines. No, with other political leaders.
I want popes going to war at each other.
Well, I mean, there were cases where there were multiple popes that was like disputed.
Oh, man.
Yeah, there was a thing where it's like, I'm the Pope. No, I'm the real Pope. Well, I'm the true Pope of God, and you're not the true Pope. Well, I'm the true Pope of God.
Oh, boy.
Anyway, so yeah, they were taking mistresses and concubines, and the list goes on. So this wasn't completely ignored. This wasn't like, c'est la vie. Like, it wasn't quite that bad. Despite Catholicism's religious monopoly in Western Europe, there were efforts at reform that I won't go into, but they occurred starting around 1470, so now we're like 35 years after the invention of the printing press here, roughly that time period. There were groups that went by the names of like the Lollards, the Brethren of Common Life, and the Hussites. You don't have to remember those names. I didn't really know who they were before I read that. The important part is kind of like the implications. So while they largely failed at creating lasting reform from within, they did pave the road for reform that would take place later and more powerfully, the Protestant Reformation. Perhaps in 1470, again, only 35 years after the invention of the printing press, they were still kind of lacking easy access to that key tool that enabled their more successful and sometimes more radical successors. You see, the printing press transformed book learning from something only elites could afford into something more or less everyone could afford. Suddenly you don't need a Catholic priest to interpret the Bible for you. Suddenly you can do your own research.
Oh, God.
Sorry. And people did. So, like today's mass media revolution, influencers emerged to help gather like-minded folk and act as interpreters of religious texts in their own right, only now, of course, it was outside the monopoly of the Catholic Church. One of these influencers, who is widely credited with kicking off the Protestant Reformation in the year of our Lord 1517 with his famous 95 Theses, despite, by the way, an original intent of just wanting to reform Catholicism from within, not sparking a revolution and creating Lutheranism, was a German man named Martin Luther. So with the full benefit of hindsight, it's hard not to see how his 95 Theses wouldn't spark that kind of revolution.
It was kind of coming, whether
it was coming, and B,
trends and forces versus
right. So there's trends and forces in hindsight, but then what I'm also saying is that if you actually read the 95 Theses, it's are you sure you weren't trying to because
do this but completely different and call it the same thing.
Right.
It doesn't really work like that.
Right. So the two basic pillars that they all revolve around is the first is that Christian salvation is only achievable by faith, not works. And to this day, that is a key pillar differentiator between Catholicism and Protestantism. And the second, and probably more importantly, at least to the historical narrative we're weaving today, is that the Bible, not the church, is the central religious authority. So again, it's kind of hard to imagine. Are you sure? You're saying the church is not the authority, the thing that people have access to, and you're not trying to... I don't know, man.
It's so interesting, though, because, me as a total outside observer, I'm the first one, I'm good work sounds good. And the second one, I'm the Bible being the authority sounds good.
One of the things that's so interesting about, Western religion is that it's there's so many reasons to root for and also hate both sides.
Yeah. You're talking about in the Catholic-Protestant divide.
Yeah. You want to be oh, man, these Protestants are crazy. Oh, man.
But also they're the
these
underdog.
Catholics are horrible.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, man, they're nut jobs. But, oh, man, they're the revolutionary, underdogs that are, for the people. I mean, even the Pilgrims, even Puritans that come over here, you're to America, right? You're
to escape religious persecution,
escape
quote,
the
unquote.
religious persecution, underdog.
To go do a more intense version of it.
Right, exactly. And so it's it feels all the time with every single faction in this mess. It's wait, no. But no.
Yeah.
But actually, let's look at your opponent. Yeah, your opponent deserves, actually, they're better in this way. It's really, it's a mess. So yeah, it's hard to imagine that second principle about the Bible being the central authority without the existence of the printing press.
Yeah.
And it's hard to imagine the Reformation happening without that underlying principle of read your own Bible, which is kind of another way of saying no need to listen to your pope or priest.
And do your own research.
Now, there are a bunch of folks who follow in Martin Luther's footsteps, either directly or more of I'm doing similar stuff for similar reasons at a similar time. So you might have heard of John Calvin, of course.
Mm-hmm. Of Calvin
and Hobbes, yep. Or I can't pronounce his first name, Zwingli. His first name is Huldrych.
Yep,
Is it Huldrych? Okay, whatever.
But yeah.
But his last name is Zwingli, which is an awesome last name. He was another famous reformer in Switzerland. There's a whole branch of the Reformation, though, referred to as the Radical Reformation. And this is where you get guys like Thomas Müntzer, John of Leyden, Jan Mathis, Menno Simons, and Jacob Amann.
All names that I know
all
very
names
well.
you absolutely know well. No, but they're not household names necessarily, but maybe by the end of this episode you'll know who they are. So yeah, we'll get back to a few of these folks. But the Radical Reformation is basically reformers and believers that were hey, Lutherans, Anglicans, you guys, you're not going far enough. You are repeating some of the same mistakes of the Catholic Church. You're getting too involved in politics, too entrenched in worldly affairs. You're becoming corrupt yourselves. And on top of that, we really disagree with you about this whole baptism thing. In fact, they're so characterized by that last part that they're labeled Anabaptists, meaning baptized again, because, well, that's what they do. Now, to be clear, Anabaptists and Radical Reformation are not they're a Venn diagram that is very close, but not 100% overlap.
Okay.
But yes, Anabaptist means baptized again, and the proper and spiritually valid way to baptize becomes a very important line of battle in this clash of religions.
Interesting.
Catholics, Lutherans, Anglicans, Eastern Orthodox, and others, they all baptize infants because they believe that baptism is a salve for more abstract things, as we mentioned, such as the healing or washing away of original sin. Again, according to Catholics and most Christians, thanks to Adam and Eve eating the apple, we were all born with original sin. We are sinners right smack out of the womb, having done nothing at all and not even having a choice in the matter. In the Catholic way of thinking, baptism relieves a person of this burden and allows them to be initiated into the church. There's also sort of like a global entry card. So, like, depending on which church you were baptized in, other churches may recognize that baptism and say, like, yeah, you're good to go.
That's cool.
So Catholics, for example, will recognize Lutheran and Eastern and Anglican baptisms and more, I believe. But that's because they have similar views on what baptism is for, why you do it, and when you do it. The Anabaptists and later Baptists, by later Baptists, I mean there are other groups later that are called Baptists, not that the Anabaptists turn into Baptists. That
Gotcha,
is
okay.
absolutely not what happens. There's a lot of confusion about that. That's not what happens. But they do share the belief that baptism, again, is more of a covenant with God and must be undertaken voluntarily, and in fact, it's referred to as believer's baptism. Thus, infant baptisms are invalid. Believer's baptism, more or less, of course, implies adult baptism, and so during the Radical Reformation, many of these reformers were baptized a second time, believing their Catholic infant baptism to be spiritually invalid. Mm-hmm. The name Anabaptist, Anabaptist, means one who baptizes again. Notably, this is what their persecutors initially called them, and the name stuck, but it's their persecutors who would have thought their second baptisms were like baptisms again, because the Anabaptists themselves would have actually said that their real baptism was their second one, right? They wouldn't have said, I'm being baptized again. They would have said, well, when I got baptized as a child, that wasn't actually even a real baptism. Right. So I'm not being baptized again. I'm being baptized for real for the first time as an adult.
Got it.
And yeah, I say persecutors because they were heavily persecuted, both by entrenched Catholic interests and also by freshly entrenched Protestant interests.
Interesting.
My limited historical understanding here is that there was also a little bit of a chicken and egg effect that went on with Radical Reformation persecution. So, yes, there was your standard, like, you aren't like us, so you must die persecution. Ugh. But also Radical Reformers had some pretty wildly insane ideas, at least for the time, around things like universal equality that would have been extremely unappealing to powers that be. So you get
those pesky powers that be.
Pesky powers. The man. So you get that nice little feedback effect where you use your printing press to distribute some pretty radical leaflets. Then you get thrown into a deep, dark Tower of London, sort of like torture cell. But then that gives more fire to the reformers to say,
baptism by blood.
Look, we're being persecuted. I told you these guys were bad, which invites an even heavier hand from authorities, and so on and so on and so on. So you get a little bit of a feedback effect going. Mm-hmm. So to recap, in 1436, we got the printing press. Prior to that, over the last several hundred years, the Catholic Church has had a religious monopoly in Western Europe, which led to corruption and abuse because of that monopoly. Martin Luther in 1517 says, hey, fellow Catholics, let's get better, and also the Bible is the final word on Christianity, not the church, and also BTW, faith not works, okay, bye. Then, whoopsie doodle, you get Lutheranism. Now, maybe that's a spark that starts a fire, or maybe other fires were getting going anyway. Certainly Henry VIII needed to cheat on all his wives, so he had to found a new religion to do that.
Had to do that.
But either way, before you know it, you have a full-blown Protestant Reformation, one subsection of which is called the Radical Reformation, that believes other Protestants aren't going far enough and we need to get back to like real grassroots Christianity, which, by the way, means you got to get baptized as a believing adult, not an infant.
Question for you.
Yes.
This episode's about the Amish.
We're getting there. We're getting there. We're almost there. We had to start 2,000 years ago. Give me a break. Are you with me so far on the sort of the recap of the Reformation?
Yes.
Okay. Anyway, hilarity, by which I mean conflict, ensues.
I don't think that's hilarious.
All right. Here is where I tell you to stop listening to this episode, because we love telling people to stop listening to our podcast. We just love it.
Stop and go listen to something else.
Yeah.
We always
Well, that's
say.
what I'm going to say, actually. Go listen to something else. And don't worry. I will give you the very rudimentary, stripped-down version of this story here in a minute. But if you want the full, detailed play-by-play on the story, you should go listen to one of my favorite all-time episodes of, you guessed it, Hardcore History.
Oh, God.
The episode is called Prophets of Doom. Mm-hmm. Sadly, I think it's old enough now that it's not streaming anymore, so you have to go buy it individually on his website. But it is well worth the $2.99, and it's probably even worth figuring out the weird, annoying way that he monetizes his old episodes. That being said, if you want the very stripped down version of the Munster Rebellion of 1534, keep listening. Starting in 1532, following a widespread peasant revolt in what we moderns would call Germany, several influential men in the city of Munster, and that's like Munster, I believe it's pronounced Munster, right?
I think so. I think it's Munster.
So several influential men in this city got the idea to set up a theocracy. The two big players that got things going here were a Lutheran minister named Bernard Rothman and his rich friend Bernard Kipperdoling.
Two Bernards.
Two Bernards, one Rothman, one Kipperdoling. I love the Kipperdoling name.
Name.
I could keep saying it over and over. Now, this guy Rothman, this Lutheran minister, he fucking hates Catholics. Hates them. So he starts writing pamphlets. And with his friend Kipperdoling bankrolling the whole project, they print them en masse for distribution. Remember our friend the printing press?
I do.
Well, Rothman and Kipperdoling make good use of this technology. It was just standard anti-Catholic screed for a while, but before long it turned to some really dangerous ideas that were much more in line with Radical Reformation Anabaptists than they were with his own Lutheranism. Namely things like total wealth redistribution.
Oh.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, a man after your own heart.
I'm listening. I'm interested.
I know.
Oh,
he would have
he's a leftist.
He would have a home on Twitter for sure.
I don't hate Catholics though.
Well, in 1532, maybe you should.
Yeah, actually.
Anyway, so this Rothman guy's pamphlets start getting a lot of poor peasant migrants from across Germany who like this whole redistribution of wealth tune that he's singing.
That's how you do it. You agitate, you organize.
He was very good at this. And since that tune is, again, also sort of in line with Anabaptism, that's kind of like the sort of the flavor of migrants that are flowing into Munster. By February of 1534, there are enough Anabaptists in Munster that Rothman and his allies are basically shoo-ins for the magisterial elections held there. Bernard Kipperdoling, the rich guy who bankrolled the pamphleteering, is installed as mayor, and most of the other Lutheran magistrates who are up for election are also defeated by allies of Bernard Rothman, which was kind of a surprise to them because up until then they assumed Rothman, who was a Lutheran minister after all, albeit with some wacky ideas about wealth redistribution, was ultimately on their side, because after all, they both hated Catholics together, right? They're Lutherans. So we have Kipperdoling, who is now mayor, and we have Rothman, who himself is preaching some very Anabaptist-style teachings, and people start to take notice. People like Jan Mathis, who I mentioned earlier, and John of Leyden, who I mentioned earlier. John of Leyden actually had a different name, but this is what his followers called him. By the way, side note here, Jan Mathis, for what it's worth, was from Haarlem.
Okay.
Not the one in Manhattan.
I'm no, he wasn't.
Not the one. He was, in fact, he was from Haarlem, but the Haarlem with two A's.
Oh, Haarlem.
Haarlem, yeah. So Manhattan was originally a Dutch settlement before becoming part of the 13 colonies.
Ooh.
And the village of Haarlem, 1A, in New Amsterdam, which was what Manhattan was before it was Manhattan, was named after the city of Haarlem back in the Netherlands.
Damn. Haarlem.
Haarlem versus Haarlem. So he was from Haarlem.
It's Haarlem.
I know it's Haarlem, but 2A Haarlem. Anyway, I digress. It doesn't matter where the Jan Mathis was from, other than it's a fun factoid that there's also a Haarlem in the Netherlands. So John of Leyden and Jan Mathis were both Anabaptist preachers and leaders in Germany and the Low Countries, and they both got word of what was going on in Munster. That there was this Lutheran who was preaching some very Anabaptist-flavored sermons, and he and his allies controlled the city, so they took their followers and went there to join forces with Rothman. In sort of like a Anabaptist-style Avengers team-up.
Cool.
So at this point, Munster was like this like Anabaptist mecca, like a ground zero for the movement. And in fact, Jan Mathis called it the New Jerusalem at this time. And then things started to get pretty fucking nuts.
Oh no.
First things first. It's not nuts yet. Actually, I probably should have said this in like a sentence or two later. But first things first, Rothman did end up deciding to go full Anabaptist when Jan Mathis arrived. Apparently, the very day he arrived into Munster, he started doing adult baptisms.
Oh, shit.
Or rebaptisms, depending on who you ask. Rothman was rebaptized that day, and thousands more adult baptisms soon followed. I imagine the environment was like a bit of a frenzy, probably because it felt like one of those like, wow, we're doing a utopia city thing like nobody's ever done before.
Right.
Like you always hear people say, like
radical utopia.
Yeah, with Rajneeshpuram, with Buddhafield, with those biosphere guys. I mean, like every single time you get a group of like idealist, like-minded reformers or spiritually aligned folks together in a community building project, you basically hear the exact same sort of like, we're trying a crazy way of living together that nobody's ever tried before, but like it's actually just like a town. So anyway, these guys were like that too, and they were super stoked about not just like, oh, we have this awesome like headquarters now, but also spreading their beliefs to other areas, gaining more territory for Anabaptists from this foothold they had in Munster. Then, of course, there was the orgiastic destruction of religious artifacts and art in Munster's cathedrals and monasteries. Pretty common sort of stuff. It's called iconoclasm. Supplanting religions have liked doing this sort of thing dating back to the dawn of civilization.
Don't they know that they need to preserve their history?
No, that's the whole thing.
Put it in a museum.
The history is powerful. It must be destroyed.
It belongs in a museum.
I know. And then, of course, there was the Shared Property Proclamation.
I'm down with that one.
Actually, first came the forced property redistribution of people emigrating into the city. These immigrants' property was taken and distributed amongst the poor.
Okay.
And following that, the leadership of the city proclaimed that all citizens' property was to be held in common. And I assume that there was like an exception for this, like for leadership, like there always is for this stuff, but that's just an assumption. I didn't read anything about that. This particular strain of Munsterian Anabaptism was also becoming millennialist, which is an adjective describing the more apocalyptic flavors of Christianity, the whole thing about like there will be an end times and then a golden age, yada, yada, yada.
This is getting real crazy.
These are the types of folks, for example, that think the Left Behind book series is more prediction than fiction. And also, we've talked about in the show before, there's some distinct flavor of this in QAnon's belief. The storm is sort of their version of the apocalypse, and then they all believe that there's going to be like this...
The Great Awakening.
A golden age to follow. Anyway, it wasn't but 2 months, February to April of 1534, before the city faced a siege, and said siege was from the third faction that hasn't popped up in the story till just now.
What?
The Catholics are back.
Oh.
So prior to the Anabaptist seizure of Munster, it was
Catholic soldiers rolled up to the gates?
Actually, yes.
Holy shit.
It was like Munster was sort of like a joint, like Lutheran. And I think a lot of places in Germany were like this, where like there's like Lutheran factions and Catholic factions, because this is the time of the Holy Roman Empire. So you still have like Catholic loyalists, but then you have like there's like a Protestant Lutheran strongholds. So it's like this very sort of like mixed thing. And then that just so happened in Munster, you have this like third destabilizing faction of the Anabaptists come in. And you could also say that, I don't know, like the Lutheran and Catholic hatred for each other was a bit of what allowed the Anabaptists to take power in Munster.
Right.
Anyway, when they did take power, they forcibly expelled this guy named Franz Von Waldick. His name isn't really important, but his title is pretty cool. He was the Prince Bishop of Munster.
Ooh.
Which was like this like halvesies religious, halvesies political role that I don't fully understand, but I guess that like that mixing of religion and politics is one of the things that Anabaptists, Munster Anabaptists and otherwise were rebelling against. So I kind of get that.
Right.
So this Prince Bishop dude Franz was like, all right, playtime's over. I'm coming with an army to siege your city. And unfortunately for the Munster rebels, they had lots of followers, but they didn't really have a military. So they didn't really have any way to oppose the siege. They just kind of sat out there and, I mean, they didn't like attack through the walls yet, but you know, they had all the time. And a lot of times what you're doing with a siege is just trying to like starve people out.
Right.
So the Munster rebels didn't have a military, but they did have nutcases though. Like Jan Mathis.
That's just as good.
Yeah. So this, if you remember Jan Mathis, one of the main Anabaptist preacher guys that comes into town after the mayor is elected in February. So on Easter Sunday in April, he's like, I'm going to pretty much single-handedly take down this army. So he went, not quite single-handedly, he went up against this army with just himself and 12 followers.
Oh.
And I don't know the numbers on the Prince Bishop side, but I do know that this would make him very, 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 very outnumbered.
Yeah.
But no matter, Mr. Mathis proclaimed that he was a second Gideon, who was a famous biblical warrior, if you're not sure who that is, and God's judgment would strike down the Prince Bishop and his army.
Okay.
Unfortunately for Jan, no such thing happened, and the sieging army easily wiped out his band, captured him, put his head on a pike, and nailed his family jewels to the city gate.
Oh, geez.
Yikes, guys.
God.
Yikes. Yeah, just when you're like, oh, this crazy person, like, you're like rooting for the Catholics, like, take out this crazy wacko,
No.
and then like a second later you're like, wait, did what? Oh, God.
Just no one's good here.
No one's good. Everyone is bad. Anyway, at this point, everything calmed down.
Did it?
Just kidding. You know how these things tend to go down.
I do.
Not comfortable and slowly down, more like down in burning flames. After Mathis's death, our other friend, John of Leyden, was named his religious and political successor, basically taking over the reins of the whole operation, probably named as such because he claimed to be receiving visions from God that he was supposed to be the successor. So success he did. And you know how these leaders get, super humble and normal, right? So John of Leyden was like, hey, first of all, I'm the direct successor to King David from the Bible. I don't know if you guys knew that.
Okay.
Like the King David that killed Goliath when he was a twink. Second of all, I have absolute power now in the city. I'm basically your holy dictator. Third of all, go ahead and deck me out in all kinds of like royal fashions and accoutrements, like really gussing me up so I really look royal.
Come on.
Fourth of all, this is no longer Munster, by the way. It's the new Zion. And fifth, it's time for polygamy.
Okay.
I mean, you knew it was coming, right?
It's
like
time.
Eventually there's polygamy with this stuff.
Oh, man.
To be fair to God Emperor John, there was apparently a 3-to-1 female to male ratio in the city at this time, and I'm not sure what the reason for that was. But to be fair to everyone else, when I say time for polygamy, what I meant was John of Leyden made polygamy compulsory.
Oh.
You had to participate.
Okay. That feels wrong.
It's not great. He himself took 16 wives.
That's too many.
And there's even an account, which is disputed, it's a disputed account, that he even beheaded someone for refusing to marry him.
Well, he shouldn't do that.
After all, it was against the law to not participate. It was compulsory.
God.
Anyway, I hate to break the bad news, but this doesn't end with like a zany charge and people's genitals on the door the way it did for Jan Mathis. Basically, everyone not named John of Leyden was starving in Munster, New Jerusalem, Zion? I don't know. It gets confusing. At this point, I don't even know where the original Bernard Rothman guy has gone. But anyway, the commoner Munsterites were all starving, thanks to largely to the Prince Bishop's siege of the town, which lasted from April of 1534 when it started all the way to June of the following year.
Jeez.
With resistance waning, the Catholic forces retook the city that June and captured John of Leyden and 2 of his co-conspirators, one of which was our friend Bernard Kipperdoling, that guy that...
The bankroller.
Yeah, the bankroller of the pamphlets who was elected mayor the previous February. These 3 were promptly tortured and executed.
Jeez.
And their bodies were stuffed into cages and hung from the steeple of the Munster Church of St. Lambert's.
You guys.
And if you ever find yourself visiting Munster, while the bones of these fellows have long since been removed, the cages still hang there today.
Oh, shit. I want to go to Munster now.
I know. And that's the story of the Munster Rebellion. So there, I lived out my fantasy of doing a Dan Carlin impression.
You did a Dan Carlin.
I did a Dan Carlin.
Dan Carlin.
Seriously, though, go listen to Prophets of Doom. His research is infinitely better than mine, and so is his storytelling. But, like, once I knew I was doing a Culture Just Weird episode about an Anabaptist group, I was like, oh, yeah. Oh, I get to talk about the Munster Rebellion. Fuck yeah. Anyway, that brings us back to the Amish, who at this point in history don't exist yet, and you asked about them earlier, so what's the deal?
Yeah, what is the deal?
Are they, like, direct descendants of these guys, or what's going on here?
What is going on here?
Well, not really, but sort of. I'll explain. The aftermath of the Munster Rebellion is a sort of a prime example of that, like, persecution chicken and egg thing I mentioned earlier, right? Like, the rebellion sent shockwaves across Europe and heavy crackdown on Anabaptists from religious and secular authorities alike ratcheted way up.
Oh, geez.
Because those authorities were so terrified of another Munster. And this level of persecution continued all the way up to and past the turn of the next century, which, if you're keeping track, that means past 1600 and well on towards even the 1700s.
Ooh.
At the same time, other Anabaptists themselves tried to genuinely distance themselves from the violent millenariist, I believe that's how you pronounce that, millenariist?
I never know.
Millenarian insurrection in Munster that bore the Anabaptist name. An entire different genealogy, if you will, of Anabaptism was developed around this time, sort of in response to the events at Munster, a genealogy that abhorred and eschewed violence, and the most important religious leader in this movement was a man by the name Menno Simons.
I know where we're going. What's his name again?
Like a lot of other Reformation figures, he started his religious career as a Catholic priest, and then became a reformer. In this case, an Anabaptist reformer. And even more importantly, he wasn't just a reformer of Catholic ways, but once he became an Anabaptist, he was a reformer of those ways as well, believing the violence in Munster to be antithetical to Scripture. Here's a quote on his importance from Wikipedia. Quote, Menno Simons' influence on Anabaptism in the Low Countries was so great that Baptist historian William Estep suggested that their history be divided into 3 periods: before Menno, under Menno, and after Menno. Menno is especially significant because of his coming to the Anabaptist movement in the North in its most troublesome days, and helping not only sustain it, but also to establish it as a viable Radical Reformation movement. End quote. It was because of Simons and his teachings that the version of Anabaptism that was able to survive, and to some degree flourish, was fundamentally oriented towards peace and nonviolence, again, sort of in response to this event at Munster. And due to that importance, this genealogy of Anabaptism bears his name to this day. Mennonites are named after Menno Simons.
There you go, Mennonites.
Boom, baby. So we're almost there now.
Almost there.
Almost there. So let's skip a ton of history and fast forward to the year 1693. Anabaptism by now is relatively established as a Protestant sect, and a group of them in Switzerland known as the Swiss Brethren have themselves a schism.
Uh-oh.
I know, it's my favorite. A disagreement between 2 leaders of the movement, Jacob Amann and Hans Reist, led to the splitting of the Swiss Brethren into 2 factions. One side of the split switched their name over to Mennonites, presumably because they too were down with Menno Simons' whole peaceful Anabaptism shtick. I think that's why they switched their name to that. Don't quote me on that because I didn't dig into that super deeply. But the other side of the split started being referred to derisively by their disagreeing brethren, the guys under Hans Reist, the guys that just decided to call themselves Mennonites. And so they were derisively calling the other group after their leader, Jacob Amann, the Amish.
And here we are. Let's go. Let's do the episode on the Amish.
No, this was the episode. Oh man. Whew. So we landed that plane. What's our time at?
Right now we are at 1 hour and 38 minutes.
Okay, so it only took us 1 hour and 38 minutes to get through 2,000 years of religious history and the entire Reformation. I mean, that's pretty good, man. You did a pretty
good job, yeah.
Come on.
You did great.
All right, so the last bit of today's story, and we are actually doing another episode on this to talk about the current day Amish, but this was the patented COJW binge on context that we like to do.
You gotta have the context before the content. You have to eat your meal before you can have your dessert.
But the last bit of today's story is simply that as a result of the legacy of persecution faced by Anabaptists, at first for religious differences, then for preaching equality ideals dangerous to entrenched power, and then finally for confirming everybody's fears with the citywide insane asylum / rebellion at Munster, all of that created a legacy of persecution that followed Anabaptists of all stripes, Mennonite, Amish, and otherwise. It followed them around Europe anyway, so they were like, F this, we out, I hear Pennsylvania is nice, and there's all kinds of religious freedom over there, as long as you're white Christians like us. But there's all kinds of that type of religious freedom over there. So, yeah, you get these migrations of folks over to the Americas. And in case you were wondering, that's where the Amish come from.
I was wondering about that. I actually had no idea how they got here.
Any thoughts, Kayla? Do you feel any differently about your own baptism after that whole big, long tale?
No.
No? Okay. All right.
I mean, I still feel good about it.
Does it make you feel like you have any different, like, relationship to, like, the history and narrative of Western civilization?
All I know is that I don't want to be aligned with any of these people. So don't take my adult baptism as, I don't know what the word is.
Support? I don't know.
Don't take my adult baptism as me throwing in my lot with any of you.
Yeah, like we mentioned earlier, it can be hard, man, to pick a side.
Just don't pick sides.
Just don't pick sides, because they all kind of are like one side is like, yeah, we got the Inquisition, we're going to torture you and kill you and be corrupt as fuck. And then the other side is like, we're going to be insane, like forced polygamy and like seizing people's possessions, and I am God Emperor of Munster now. So it's like, either way is bad.
I support not supporting either of you.
Anyway, next time on Cult or Just Weird, we will get into the American Amish and other plain people and talk about their community and culture present day. And then, of course, we'll do our gimmick with the criteria, where I expect we'll spend some extra time talking about the whole is it niche within society criterion, maybe some extra time on the ritual criterion as well.
I think it'll be because we're evaluating not just a religion, but like a religious lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very, like, can be a very intense religious lifestyle. It might take us a little finessing, little noodling.
And as we have discovered from today's episode, the Amish, we might consider them niche now, which we'll talk about again in this next episode. But Anabaptists have always been sort of niche. They've always been like, and certainly at the time, certainly in the 1500s, non-Anabaptists probably would have called them a cult, right? They probably would have, they almost certainly would have called the Munster Anabaptists a cult.
Right.
I might call them a cult. So again, it kind of harkens back to the whole like new religious movement. At what point do we stop calling that a cult? At which point do we start calling it its own full-fledged religion? Right. Now, Anabaptism has been around for like 500 years, and they have plenty of followers, so I think that crosses the line into club religion, but it's gray. It's fuzzy. Who knows?
A fuzzy gray area.
My sources for this episode included Wikipedia, of course, Encyclopedia Britannica, Oxford Research Encyclopedia, pewforum.org, ideaexchange.uakron.edu, Quora. Sorry, I wanted to know the difference between Baptists and Anabaptists, and they had some good answers there. If you're curious, we mentioned Baptists before. They both share the core tenet of believers' baptism, so adult baptism, but they have very different like groups, locations / dates of origin, like their origin story, like they come from very different places. And functionally in modern society, Baptists tend to integrate into society, whereas Anabaptists tend more towards like the plain culture. My other sources include CornishBirdblog.com. I had to go there to read up on the dolly dunking thing. And of course, good old Dan Carlin's hardcore history episode, Prophets of Doom. I suppose you could also count our reading of Behind Blue Curtains as sort of like sunk cost research for this episode as well.
Oh, yeah, I think that makes sense.
We did that for the other episode. It counts for research for this one. And that is it for my sources as well as for my historical narrative.
I'm very excited to dive into the episode 2 weeks from now to eat my dessert for all of this delicious context, because having honestly
context
having
is
all
my
of
dessert.
This, yeah, that's true. Having all of this context is extremely helpful. It does give me information about my baptism as well as your baptism, as well as other people's, as well as like I always knew that there was conflict between Catholics and Protestants, but I didn't know how deep that rabbit hole goes.
And there was also conflict between Protestants and other Protestants.
Right.
So once you get that sharding with a D, people that are have differing religious opinions can be pretty upset at each other sometimes.
It gets crazy. Calm down, everybody.
So anyway, yeah, I'm looking forward to next episode too, and I'll say this: I'm hoping there'll be a nice surprise for us for that one.
Okay.
So
I like a good surprise.
Hopefully that'll keep your ears peeled, folks.
Okay.
And that is it for me for this episode. So, don't subscribe, just listen and enjoy. But if you want to go subscribe to our Patreon, I suppose that's fine because business, money.
Patreon.com/cultigisweird.
But seriously, just enjoy the show. That's my call to action for everyone.
I'm Kayla.
And I'm Chris.
And this has been...
Cult or just New Religious Movement.
New Religious Movement or just weird.
Or just weird.